In this section, we're looking at energy and other limiting factors that control primary productivity. Primary productivity or primary production is the amount of energy converted to chemical energy by autotrophs. So typically we're looking at sunlight being converted into organic molecules by plants or algae or other photosynthetic organisms like bacteria. We could certainly do the same thing for chemosynthesis, though. It would be any energy conversions that were done by producers that are chemosynthetic. The amount of photosynthetic production sets the spending limit for an ecosystem's budget, meaning the amount of photosynthesis done by the plant determines how much energy there'll be for herbivores and then for carnivores, etc. So the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface is the major limiting factor for life, and we only get a small fraction of the overall solar energy that leaves the sun. And only a little bit of that is actually usable. Okay, so what we need to do for this section is define gross primary productivity and net primary productivity. So just like if you had a job, the terms gross and net mean kind of the same thing if you had a business that you were running. So your gross earnings, let's say you had a lawn mowing business, and let's say you made $15 an hour mowing lawns, and maybe the cost, maybe it would cost you $5 for gas per hour or whatever. So your net earnings would be 10, right? So 15 minus 5, and you would get $10 of take-home pay. So net is really what you get at the end of the day. It's the take-home pay. Gross is what you get in the beginning, I guess. So total primary production is known as the ecosystem's gross primary productivity, and we're going to shorten that as GPP. So it's the conversion of light into ATP. Minus nothing. It's just the original stuff that you make, but it's not what you get at the end of the day if you're a plant. What you get at the end of the day if you're a plant is net primary production. So it's all of the photosynthesis that you did, all the energy conversion from light to ATP, minus the stuff you had to use that day or during that period of time. So net productivity, what you get at the end of the day, is the total, right? The gross primary productivity minus the cellular respiration that you had to do that day. So it's the amount of photosynthesis overall that you kind of get as take-home pay. So net primary productivity can be expressed as joules per meter squared per year, or as biomass, so grams per meter squared per year. So it can be either measured as energy per unit area or as biomass per unit area. And we can define it as really the amount of new biomass added in a given time. So only net primary productivity is available to consumers because the plant did its original photosynthesis, right? But then it did some cellular respiration, right? And that's not available to consumers. So you have to subtract that out to get your net primary productivity. Places like tropical rainforests are super productive, and so this end here is the most productive places. Oceans are not super productive, but we have a lot of ocean, and so their net primary production is big because there's so much of them, but really our most intense areas of primary productivity would be rainforests and estuaries and coral reefs. Here's this next term, net ecosystem production. Now we're taking into account the cellular respiration by everybody. So we'll take into account the animals and the fungi and stuff. So net ecosystem production is the measure of the total biomass accumulation during a given period. So it's the gross primary productivity minus the total respiration of all organisms. So the difference between before we were looking at net primary productivity, and we said it was gross primary productivity minus respiration. Looks like the same thing, but the R was for plants last time. And this time the R is cellular respiration for all organisms. So it's the gross primary productivity minus the total respiration of all organisms in the ecosystem, and that will give us our total biomass accumulation. And when we do this, we can look at amounts of carbon dioxide and oxygen. So when plants do photosynthesis, CO2 is brought out of the air. And when either plants or animals do cellular respiration, we're adding CO2 back to the air. So make sure you do remember that plants do cellular respiration, right? That's one thing that students miss a lot. Whether it's them, using their mitochondria to break down. So let me put it this way. Plants will take carbon dioxide from the air, they'll do photosynthesis, and they'll make organic molecules like sugar, right? So here's sugar. They might use that sugar to make cellulose to grow, right? Or they might break that sugar down to make more ATP, maybe at night or when they're not doing photosynthesis. And that's going to release the CO2. So that's cellular respiration. Or they can die and their bodies can be broken down. Animals will eat the plants and then do cellular respiration, so that's going to add CO2 to the atmosphere as well. And the opposite would be true for oxygen, right? So oxygen will be produced by photosynthesis and used by cellular respiration. This picture is for carbon. In an aquatic ecosystem, remember aquatic is water. So in marine, which means salt water, right, and freshwater ecosystems, light and nutrients both control primary productivity. So if you go too deep, you're not going to have enough sunlight. And the amount of nitrogen or phosphorus might also control the amount of photosynthesis that's done. So light limitations, the depth of light penetration affects primary productivity. So the photic zone is the area where light actually penetrates. Below that, you're not going to be able to do photosynthesis if you are a photosynthetic organism. Nutrient limitation. So we need to define this idea of limiting nutrient. It's the element that has to be added in order for production to increase. So you might look at photosynthesis and think, okay, I've got carbon dioxide and water if I'm a plant, right? And of course you need sunlight, and the plants are going to make glucose plus oxygen, right? And it might not be plants, it might be bacteria or algae or whatever. But anyway, photosynthetic organisms will do this reaction. And so you might think, okay, I've got carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, and that's all there is. And you would be correct. However, in order for anything to grow, they're going to need some DNA, correct? And they all need enzymes, right? And their bodies are built out of carbohydrates and lipids, but proteins also. So they're also going to need proteins. And so if you remember back to organic chemistry, proteins have CHO, but they also have nitrogen and sulfur. And DNA and RNA have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but they also have nitrogen and phosphorus. So nitrogen can be a big limiting factor, as can phosphorus, or I guess even sulfur. And then, of course, we need other elements for certain functions. Like if you're a person, you need a certain amount of iron to carry oxygen in your blood. You might need zinc as a co-vitamin or something. So there are various limiting nutrients, and it depends on the ecosystem as to which nutrient is limiting. So you can't continue to do photosynthesis if you don't have enough nitrogen to make your DNA, right? Because your cells won't do mitosis because they don't have enough DNA in them. So typically nitrogen and phosphorus are the nutrients that are most limiting to aquatic ecosystems. Phosphorus being the one we usually worry about most in terms of getting the parts per million down to a very, very, very low number. It's typically the limiting nutrient. So if I were to give you a graph like this, study it for a little bit. Here's collection sites and phytoplankton density. So phytoplankton, these are photosynthetic organisms that, think zoo for animal, zooplankton, those are going to be consumers. Phytoplankton are producers. And so in this study along the coast of Long Island, which nutrient limits phytoplankton production? So ammonia enriched. So it looks like if they add ammonia to this collection site, there's a lot of phytoplankton made. But if they add phosphate, there's not so much. And if they add nothing, unenriched control. Unenriched means you're not adding anything, right? So you don't get very much growth. And actually, that looks like it's true for each collection site. So it looks like ammonium enriched. When you add the ammonium, then you get a lot of phytoplankton growth. And ammonium has nitrogen in it. So nitrogen is the limiting factor here. In lakes, phosphorus usually limits growth more than nitrogen. And so phosphorus you get from weathering of stones, right? So here's rock, and we'll talk about nutrient cycles later, but they're weathered, and then some of that gets into the water. And so the plants in here, or the bacteria or whatever, are going to use the phosphorus and they'll grow. You can also, though, add phosphorus to the ecosystem by, let's say, fertilizing the land up here, for example, or some other way add phosphorus into the ecosystem, like phosphate in detergents. Let's say there's a housing complex nearby. Extra phosphorus means extra growth, usually. So that can be a bad thing, because increased addition of these limiting resources will usually cause early eutrophication. So cultural eutrophication, it's called. So eutrophication is when a lake fills in. And so the way it works is that you have plants growing here, they do photosynthesis, and when they die, they fall to the bottom and it starts to fill in the lake. And this might take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to fill in a lake, right? From a deep lake here to one that's very filled in to eventually completely covered over. Cultural eutrophication means we're adding nutrients. People are adding nutrients to the lake, usually by accident. It could be agricultural runoff or industrial runoff, or even from people's homes. And so it makes the whole cycle go much, much faster, and the whole thing can happen in decades instead of centuries. Here's a particular example from I don't know how to say this, Sargasso Sea. And this is showing that actually iron is the limiting nutrient. So it's not always phosphorus or nitrogen. This is upwelling of nutrient-rich waters in different parts of the oceans, and the mixing that you get in lakes as well can also increase productivity. So if you have areas that have deeper, colder water, usually the good nutrients will have fallen to the ground, to the bottom, because photosynthesis will happen up here, and a lot of the nutrients are taken out of the water, and then when plants and animals die, they fall to the bottom, and so you've got lots of nutrients here without photosynthesis. And so if the whole thing turns over, then you're getting nutrients up here, and that can increase productivity. So whether that's an ocean or a lake, that can happen. Okay, terrestrial ecosystems. Terrestrial means land. And it's usually the temperature and the water level that affect primary productivity. So the more rain you get in general, the higher the net annual primary productivity. Evapotranspiration, the water transpired by plants and evaporated to landscape. That's just a definition for you. It's evaporation out of plants. It's also affected by how much rain you get, or precipitation, right? The temperature and the solar energy. So with more heat, you get more evapotranspiration. And so the more water, the higher your net primary production. So there are some adaptations that will reduce nutrient limitations. A lot of times, if you're looking just at a very small area, local area, it's the soil nutrients in a particular area that affect primary production. So nitrogen is usually the limiting nutrient in terrestrial ecosystems, and that's because nitrogen is needed to make proteins, and it's needed to make nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. And so this is a little part of a chain of a protein. And so here's nitrogen. Carbon, carbon, oxygen. Here's nitrogen, carbon, carbon, oxygen. Anyway, all these are nitrogen. And you can't make proteins, or DNA for that matter, without nitrogen. And so if you can't make the parts that you need to grow, like your DNA and your proteins, then photosynthesis will slow down because you're not doing photosynthesis to grow because you don't have enough nitrogen. Phosphorus can also be a limiting nutrient. So here's DNA, and here's phosphorus in that. Also, every one of your phospholipids in every single membrane, whether it's a cell membrane or one of the internal organelle membranes, they've all got phosphorus here as well, and actually nitrogen for that matter. So these are elements that are super important for any kind of growth of any kind of organism. There are some adaptations that help plants get more nitrogen, and one is that some organisms, like legumes, can have these mutualistic symbiotic relationships with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and so they actually produce these root nodules, and in those root nodules, the nitrogen-fixing bacteria can live. And so the bacteria are going to get sugar. Bacteria will get sugar from the plant, and water, and the bacteria are going to give the plant nitrogen, or nitrogen that's usable. There are other adaptations that help plants access the nitrogen from the soil. So one is that most plants have mutualisms with these mycorrhizal fungi, and so this is a root from a plant, and these are the root hairs, which are these little adaptations that increase the surface area of the root so they can absorb more water and nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Bees are fungi that have a mutualistic relationship with the plant. So the plant gives them sugar, and they help the plant to have an incredible surface area here to absorb more nutrients and more water.